This is TradeFlow News, bringing you relevant news and insights from around the world. TradeFlow News, enabling trade for SMEs and economies worldwide.
These are some of the key topics that we will be looking into in today's program.
First, let's take a look at the overnight headlines which are impacting the commodity markets.
Oil prices closed down nearly $1 on Friday as traders awaited talks between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin, which could lead to an easing of the sanctions imposed on Moscow over the war in Ukraine. Brent crude futures settled 99 cents, or 1.5%, lower at $65.85 a barrel, while U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude futures eased $1.16, or 1.8%, lower at $62.80. Trump has said he believes Russia is prepared to end the war, but he has also threatened to impose secondary sanctions on countries that buy Russian oil if there is no progress with peace talks.
The United States has had internal discussions on using Russian nuclear-powered icebreaker vessels to support the development of gas and LNG projects in Alaska as one of the possible deals to aim for when President Donald Trump meets Vladimir Putin on Friday, three sources familiar with the matter told Reuters. Trump landed in Alaska on Friday for what he called a high-stakes summit with Russia's Putin to discuss a ceasefire deal for Ukraine and end the deadliest war in Europe since World War II. Both the US and Russian presidents, meeting at a Cold War-era Air Force base in Alaska's largest city, are seeking wins from their first face-to-face talks since Trump returned to the White House.
Moving on to the top news in the energy sector.
Asian spot liquefied natural gas, LNG, prices declined this week on soft demand and strong storage inventories and as markets awaited the outcome of a meeting between US President Donald Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin later today. The average LNG price for September delivery into Northeast Asia Ingers was at $11.65 per million British thermal units, MMBTU, down from $11.90 per MMBTU last week, industry sources estimated. The contract for October delivery was estimated at $11.45 per MMBTU.
The U.S. Treasury Department on Friday unveiled stricter rules for how solar and wind projects can qualify for federal tax subsidies that President Donald Trump's new tax and spending law is phasing out over the next 2 years. The revisions change long-standing definitions for what it means for a project to be considered under construction by requiring developers of big solar arrays and wind farms to complete physical work rather than simply show that they have invested capital. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which Trump signed into law last month, requires projects to begin construction by July of next year or enter service by the end of 2027 to qualify for a 30% tax credit and bonuses that can push the subsidy even higher. Next, we have the top news in metal markets. U.S. President Donald Trump said on Friday he would announce tariffs on imports of steel and semiconductor chips in coming weeks. "I'll be setting tariffs next week and the week after on steel and on, I would say, chips," Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One as he headed to a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. He said the rates would be lower at the start to allow companies to build up domestic manufacturing in the U.S., rising sharply later, following a pattern he has also outlined for tariffs on pharmaceuticals. He gave no exact rates.
Copper prices steadied on Friday as gloomy economic data from top metals consumer China was balanced by a weaker dollar and hopes the data would spur Beijing to unleash more stimulus. 3-month copper on the London Metal Exchange was up 0.2% at $9,782 a metric ton at 1600 GMT, down from a 2-week peak hit on Tuesday. Data on Friday showed that China's factory output growth slumped to an 8-month low in July while retail sales slowed sharply.
We will now look at the top news in the agricultural sector.
U.S. corn and soybean futures rose on Friday on short covering ahead of the weekend and a closely followed crop tour set to begin surveying fields across the Midwest next week. Chicago Board of Trade wheat also edged higher after concerns about big global supplies dragged the market to contract lows earlier this week. Corn and wheat futures were on pace for weekly declines for a fourth straight week as abundant supplies weighed on both markets, while soybeans were set to post a weekly gain for the first time in 4 weeks after a smaller than expected U.S. crop forecast from the U.S. Department of Agriculture this week. That is all for today's news on commodity markets. Stay tuned to TradeFlow News as we continue to provide you with more updates. We also invite you to follow us on Twitter at TradeFlow News, which allows you to watch our program on your mobile device or desktop to receive information from there.